Excavación en la casa de Andrés N., el chino, presunto feminicida de Atizapán.
The neighbor knocked on the door with a plate of food. Carnitas, he said, slow-cooked pork, the kind you find at any street market in Mexico. He was always doing things like that. Always generous. Always smiling. A grey-haired man in his 70s who walked through the neighborhood with the unhurried confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. The neighbors called him El Chino, a common Mexican nickname for someone with slightly wavy hair, and they said he was good people. He organized community events. He helped elderly residents access government programs. He sat at his neighbors' tables and ate their food and laughed at their jokes. And when forensic investigators finally tore open the concrete floor of his house in May 2021, they found 4,600 human bone fragments buried underneath it. The meat he had been giving away to his neighbors for decades was not pork. His name was Andrés Filomeno Mendoza Celis, and the press would come to call him El Caníbal de Atizapán, the cannibal of Atizapán. Atizapán de Zaragoza is not the kind of place that appears on tourist maps. It sits on the northwestern edge of Mexico City's massive urban sprawl, one of those municipalities that the capital absorbed without anyone really noticing. 500,000 people packed into colonias, which are working-class residential neighborhoods built on hills, connected by narrow streets and the constant noise of minibuses and food vendors. The kind of place where people recognize each other's faces, but not each other's business. Where a man can live on the same block for 40 years and remain, in the ways that matter most, a complete stranger. That is exactly what Andrés Mendoza was for 30 years, on a street called Calle Margaritas, Marigold Street, in a neighborhood called Lomas de San Miguel, in a house where the front door always seemed to be open and something was always cooking on the stove. Mendoza was not originally from there. He was born in 1947 in the southern state of Oaxaca, one of the poorest and most culturally rich states in Mexico, home to ancient indigenous civilizations, dry mountain landscapes, and the agave fields used to produce mezcal, the traditional distilled spirit of the region. He came from a Zapotec family, one of Mexico's oldest indigenous peoples, with a civilization that predates the Aztec Empire by centuries. His father drank and could turn violent with the children, but Mendoza spoke of him with admiration years later in prison. His father was a community leader in their village, the man people came to when they had problems, the man who organized and mediated and commanded a quiet, informal authority. That image, the respected man who everybody trusts, who everybody feeds, became the blueprint that Mendoza would spend his entire adult life performing. In the 1980s, like millions of Mexicans before him, he left Oaxaca and moved north to the area surrounding Mexico City. He ended up in Atizapán. He trained as a butcher at the local municipal slaughterhouse, learning how to break down a carcass with technical precision. He later ran his own butcher shop in the neighborhood. He studied anatomy. He learned how to handle, store, and process meat over long periods. Skills that, as investigators would note with grim understatement after his arrest, proved directly relevant to what he did inside that house on Calle Margaritas. By the mid-2000s, his public persona had reached its peak. He was appointed president of the Neighborhood Citizens Participation Council, a government-linked committee that manages local issues and connects residents to municipal services. He organized street cleanups. He pushed for better infrastructure. He helped neighbors with paperwork. He prepared food for community celebrations. When the neuroscientist Dr. Fegi Ostrowski, who spent 6 hours interviewing him in prison for a documentary series, asked him about the proudest moment of his life, he didn't hesitate. He said it was when the neighborhood chose him as their representative. He said he prepared 600 tamales, traditional Mexican corn dough stuffed with filling and steamed in corn husks, for a community party. The investigators who later heard this quietly noted that the origin of the filling could not be verified. Authorities believe the killing began around 1990 or 1991. That means that while Mendoza was working at the slaughterhouse, while he was learning how to cut and process meat, he was also, according to investigators, beginning to kill. And he would not stop for 30 years. His method was patient and consistent. He frequented the bars and cantinas of Atizapán and the neighboring municipality of Tlalnepantla, dimly lit places where a generous older man with time to spare doesn't attract attention. He looked for women who were alone, women who were economically vulnerable, women who had come to the city from somewhere else and didn't have deep local roots. He offered help. He offered money.
He told some women he could connect them with government social programs. He was warm and familiar and completely unthreatening in appearance. And when a woman agreed to go with him, when she walked through the front door of 22 Calle Margaritas, she did not come back out. 3 of his victims have been formally identified by name in court proceedings, and their stories tell you everything about who he chose and why. Flor Ninive was a 38-year-old divorced mother of 2 teenage daughters who worked at a bar in Tlalnepantla. The weekend she disappeared in 2016, her daughters had gone to stay with their father. When they came back, the apartment was empty. The last message Flor sent her daughters before she disappeared read, "Take care of yourselves. I miss you." Those daughters would not learn what had happened to their mother until 5 years later, when investigators found her voter ID card inside Mendoza's home, along with the IDs of dozens of other women. Rubicela was 32 years old, originally from the northern city of Monterrey, who had moved to Mexico City to build a better life for herself and her 5-year-old son. She was delivering food on a delivery app to make extra income. She had plans to study engineering. She disappeared in July 2019. Her son was left alone in the apartment for 4 days before anyone came. When Mendoza was arrested 2 years later and Rubicela's ID showed up in the evidence, her family finally understood what had happened to her. And there were at least 15 more women behind them, women whose bone fragments were catalogued in evidence bags, whose personal belongings were arranged neatly in Mendoza's house as if they were trophies on a shelf. The most devastating single detail in this entire case is not what Mendoza did inside that house. It is what happened outside it. After one of his victims disappeared, her sister, a woman named Matilde, refused to accept the silence. She investigated on her own. She asked around the neighborhood. She found out that the last person seen with her sister was the man they called El Chino. So Matilde went to the Ministerio Público, Mexico's equivalent of a district attorney's intake office, and she brought Andrés Mendoza with her. She physically walked the man into a government building and handed him to investigators. Mendoza gave a statement. He looked the investigators in the eye. He said what he needed to say. And then they let him walk out the door. He went back to Calle Margaritas, where the bones of more than a dozen women were already buried beneath the floor. And he kept going. This was not an isolated failure. It was a pattern that repeated for 30 years. Families who reported missing relatives were largely ignored. Missing persons cases were opened and went cold. The two municipalities between which Mendoza moved, Atizapán and Tlalnepantla, operated under different jurisdictional structures and rarely coordinated their investigations. The women he targeted were among those least likely to generate urgent, sustained institutional response. And in Mexico, that margin is brutally wide. In this country, approximately 10 women are killed every single day. Thousands more disappear each year and are never reclassified as murdered. Mendoza didn't create that reality. He simply recognized it, intuitively or deliberately, and operated inside it for 3 decades with almost total impunity. He was not protected by a clever disguise or an elaborate cover story. He was protected by the simple fact that the system had already decided these women did not require urgency. Inside the house, he had built what investigators would later describe as a private archive. Videotapes on which he had filmed himself committing the crimes. Photographs of his victims, organized like a collection. And a notebook, handwritten, approximately 20 pages filled on both sides, that functioned as a detailed logbook. The fire captain who participated in the investigation described its contents in the documentary series made after the arrest. Weight measurements, body parts recorded by kilogram. This was not the work of a man who had lost control. It was the work of a man who felt completely in control, who had 30 years of evidence confirming that nothing would ever happen to him. He also solved the problem of excess remains with the same practical efficiency. He cooked the meat. He told neighbors it was wild boar from Oaxaca or seasoned pork. He offered it to people on the street. He sold it by the kilogram to residents who told investigators afterward that it had tasted fine. He invited the local police officers who patrolled Calle Margaritas to eat. They accepted. Nobody asked questions. In the neighborhood, that was simply who El Chino was. The generous old man who always had something good on the stove. He was not caught because of any investigative work. He was caught because one husband would not accept that his wife had simply disappeared. Reina González Amador was 34 years old, a mother of 2 young daughters who ran a small stall selling cell phone accessories to support her family. She had known Mendoza for years. He was the neighborhood's community organizer, the man who solved problems, and Reina's family had included him in their lives. He had eaten at their table. He had attended family celebrations. On the morning of May 14th, 2021, Reina told her husband she was going to the commercial district with Mendoza to restock her stall, a completely ordinary errand. Mendoza was a known and trusted person. Her husband wasn't worried. At first. Reina didn't come home. She didn't answer her phone. By that evening, her husband Bruno, a chief of municipal police,
trained in investigation, was already moving. He checked security camera footage from businesses near Mendoza's house. The cameras showed Reina entering the property on Calle Margaritas. They did not show her leaving. Bruno went to Mendoza's door. Mendoza answered. He was calm. He denied everything. He held eye contact without flinching, with the composure that investigators and psychologists would later describe as one of his defining characteristics: the ability to look directly at a person in pain and show nothing on his face. Bruno pushed past him and went inside. What he found on a table inside that house was his wife's body, dismembered. He restrained Mendoza immediately. He called for backup. Police units arrived within minutes. And Andrés Filomeno Mendoza Celis, 73 years old, dressed like any other retired man in any other colonia in Mexico, was placed under arrest on the afternoon of May 15, 2021. What investigators found over the following days overwhelmed them. Cadaver dogs alerted almost immediately, moving through the property with a certainty that left no room for interpretation. Forensic excavation teams worked for weeks. The chemical smell that struck investigators the moment they entered, sharp, acidic, like vinegar, was later attributed to compounds Mendoza had apparently been applying for years to accelerate decomposition and reduce odor. He had identified the problem and solved it. The final bone count stood at 4,600 individual fragments, most likely corresponding to 19 individuals, 17 women, 1 man, and 1 child. The identity of that child has never been publicly confirmed. Along with the bones, investigators catalogued dozens of voter ID cards belonging to women who had been reported missing over the preceding 3 decades. Photographs, videotapes, clothing, shoes, jewelry, and the notebook with its pages of handwritten measurements. When they interrogated him, Mendoza was serene. He admitted killing Reina. He admitted there had been others. He said in a statement broadcast nationally on Mexican television, "Las cosas que ya se hicieron, hay que aguantarlas." What has already been done? You just have to accept it. In his later interview with Dr. Ostrowski, he said he had enjoyed the taste of human flesh. He said he had shared the meat because there was simply more than he could manage alone. When she asked him what he ate in prison, he expressed visible disgust. Vegetables. Squash. That contrast between 30 years of eating whatever he wanted and a prison tray of calabazas seemed to bother him more than anything else in the conversation. And when investigators pressed him across multiple sessions on why he had done this for so long, his answer was consistent and straightforward. He said, because it was possible, because there were no consequences, because nobody ever came. And for 30 years, he had been completely right. The legal process that followed moved with a methodical determination that stood in sharp contrast to 3 decades of institutional failure. On March 18, 2022, a judge sentenced Mendoza to life imprisonment for the murder of Reina González Amador. The prosecution didn't stop there. Over the next 2 years, they built separate cases for victim after victim, taking each one individually before a judge. A second sentence, 55 years. A third, 92 years, which included the killing of the unidentified child. Then 4 more convictions of 55 years each, handed down one by one through 2023. And in February 2024, an 8th conviction, 55 more years for another victim whose family had spent nearly a decade without answers. The total accumulated against Andrés Filomeno Mendoza Celis now exceeds 420 years. He is serving those sentences at a high-security prison in the mountains of southern Estado de Mexico. He is in his late 70s. He will die inside that facility. 3 victims have been formally named in court. An estimated 15 or more remain identified only by bone fragments and the objects found in a house the neighborhood walked past every single day for 30 years.
The forensic identification process continues. More names may still come. More families may still receive the answers they have been carrying. Mexico's Supreme Court of Justice, the country's highest judicial authority, took the extraordinary step of producing and broadcasting a documentary series about this case on its own television channel. An institution acknowledging, through the act of making a film, that what happened was not simply the work of a monster operating in secret. It was the product of a system that had decided, across 3 decades, that certain women could disappear without generating urgency. The documentary was called Cannibal, Indignación Total, Total Indignation. The title was deliberate, because indignation is the only proportionate response to a case where a man fed his neighbour's human flesh for 30 years, was personally handed to investigators by a grieving family member while he was still killing, and walked out of that building and went home and kept going. The bones beneath the floor of 22 Calle Margaritas were there the whole time, while El Chino organised neighbourhood cleanups, while he helped elderly residents with paperwork, while he invited police officers to eat and they thanked him and left, while families sat in Ministerio Público waiting rooms holding photographs of women who were already buried under a concrete floor 3 streets away. The question this case leaves behind is not what kind of man does something like this. The question is, what kind of system makes it possible for 30 years? And the harder question, the one that nobody in Mexico, and honestly nobody anywhere, has fully answered, is what it takes to make sure the next man who operates the same way doesn't get 3 decades before anyone comes to his door. If you made it to the end of this story, drop a comment below. Did you already know about El Caníbal de Atizapán? Or is this the first time you're hearing this case? I genuinely want to know how far this story has travelled. And if this channel covers the kind of cases you think deserve to be told in full, with the victims named and remembered, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The next case is just as buried, and just as important to find.